Imagine living your entire life building trust with someone only to discover, when it's far too late, that nothing was what it seemed. This is the chilling reality behind the disturbing case of Lynn Hernan, a case that has haunted Wisconsin, law enforcement, and true crime followers for years. Tonight, we're going deep into every detail: her life, her death, the strange evidence found in her home, the hidden secrets surrounding her family, and the questions that remain unanswered. Was Lynn's death truly an accident? Or was it something much darker? Stay with me until the end, because this case twists in ways you won't expect. And the final revelations may change how you look at trust, family, and betrayal forever. Before tragedy made her name a headline. Before investigators pieced together a case filled with contradictions, Lynn Hernan was simply Lynn. A woman who laughed with friends, leaned on her family, and moved through life in ways that seemed ordinary until they weren't. Lynn Marie Hernan was born in 1957 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. To many, she came across as a quintessential Midwestern woman, grounded, approachable, and deeply tied to the values of family and community. Her childhood was described as stable but modest. She grew up in a middle-class household, the kind where neighbors looked out for one another, and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. Friends from her youth remembered Lynn as a girl who was both gentle and determined, never the loudest in the room, but always someone you could count on. By all accounts, Lynn carried those early values into adulthood. She valued hard work, she believed in loyalty, and she never forgot where she came from. Lynn grew older. She found herself drawn into the world of administrative and clerical work. She was detail-oriented, organized, and reliable, qualities that made her a valuable employee wherever she went. Coworkers later described her as the glue in the office. She wasn't flashy or ambitious in the corporate sense, but she kept things running smoothly. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, brought in baked goods, and offered a listening ear when someone was struggling. To her peers, Lynn was steady, dependable, someone you could trust with both the small and big things. And yet, beneath that image of reliability, there were moments where her life didn't always reflect that same order and stability. Those who knew Lynn personally often described her as generous with her time. If a neighbor needed help moving a piece of furniture, Lynn would volunteer. If a friend was going through a breakup, Lynn was the one sitting across the table with coffee, ready to listen. Her family echoed this same sentiment. She was, in many ways, the reliable daughter, the dependable sister. Holidays were spent together, and Lynn rarely missed family gatherings. But as we dig deeper, a more complicated picture begins to form. Though she was deeply loved, Lynn carried struggles that she didn't always share openly. Some revolved around finances, others around her health. And some, it seems, were tied to the kind of loneliness that can creep into a person's life slowly, almost unnoticed. To the outside world, Lynn appeared approachable, even cheerful. Neighbors spoke of her warm smile and how she seemed genuinely interested in others. But privately, Lynn was also someone who kept her deepest worries closely guarded. Friends admitted that sometimes she would change the subject when conversations turned to personal. It wasn't that she was unfriendly, just that she preferred being the listener rather than the one opening up. This balance between openness and privacy made her both relatable and slightly mysterious. You could know Lynn for years and still feel there were parts of her life you didn't fully understand. Like many, Lynn's life was far from perfect. She faced financial challenges at different points, living paycheck to paycheck, trying to balance the rising costs of living with limited resources. Friends later revealed she sometimes borrowed money, though she was always careful to pay it back. She also faced health struggles. By her early 60s, Lynn was managing medical conditions that impacted her daily routine. While she rarely complained, she often seemed fatigued, and there were subtle signs that her body was wearing down faster than her spirit. And then there were her relationships. Lynn had experienced love, but not always the lasting kind. At times, she struggled with loneliness, longing for companionship but hesitant to fully trust again. It was in this intersection between stability and vulnerability that Lynn's story truly begins to take shape. As we build this portrait of Lynn Hernan, one thing becomes clear. She was more than a case file. She was a woman of contrasts. On the surface, she embodied warmth, reliability, and quiet strength. But just beneath that, there were struggles, unspoken worries, unanswered questions, and a sense that things didn't always line up. Her finances didn't always reflect the steady life she projected. Her health challenges weren't always visible, yet they loomed in the background. And her relationships, while marked by love and loyalty, were also shadowed by moments of isolation. All of these elements, the warmth, the struggles, quiet mysteries, would play a role in the way her life was remembered and in the disturbing circumstances of her death. Lynn Hernan wasn't just another name in a headline. She was a woman with history, with flaws, with love and struggle woven into her daily life. October 22nd, 2018. The leaves had begun to fall in Waukesha, Wisconsin, painting the quiet suburban streets in shades of red and gold. It seemed like an ordinary morning, but for the small community that Lynn Hernan called home, this day would be anything but ordinary. Because this was the day Lynn's carefully constructed world would collapse into a mystery that even now, years later, leaves more questions than answers. Lynn's home, a modest single-story house, sat quietly at the end of a peaceful street. But inside, something was terribly wrong. For hours, no one knew. No one could have imagined. It wasn't until Lynn failed to answer her phone, failed to show up to work, failed to do what she always did that alarm bells started ringing. Lynn's family, concerned by the silence, decided to check on her. It was a family member who entered her home first. And it's here where the details become chilling. Because instead of finding Lynn bustling around her kitchen or sitting in her favorite chair, they found her lifeless, slumped in a chair, in what appeared at first glance to be a tragic accident, or perhaps even just natural causes. She looked peaceful, almost as if she had simply drifted off to sleep. But the truth, as we would soon learn, was far more complicated. To the untrained eye, nothing about the scene immediately screamed foul play. Lynn was in her recliner, a blanket nearby, her television on. No signs of forced entry. No shattered glass. No blood spatter. Nothing that would suggest violence had erupted inside her home that night. But to the trained eyes of investigators, details began to stand out, and not in a comforting way. Near Lynn were several bottles of prescription medication. It's not unusual considering Lynn's health struggles. But the sheer number of bottles and the mix of medications raised eyebrows. Was this simply a tragic case of accidental overdose? Or had someone intentionally staged the scene? When police arrived on the scene, their initial report reflected what most people thought. This looked like a natural death, an unfortunate but seemingly straightforward case. In fact, one of the earliest assumptions was that Lynn had quietly passed away in her sleep, perhaps from a combination of health issues and medication side effects. But as law enforcement walked through the home, combing through the small details, they began to notice things that didn't quite add up. A stack of financial documents on the kitchen counter, oddly positioned. A handwritten note left in plain sight. And prescriptions that didn't all seem to belong to Lynn. These weren't the things you'd expect to stumble upon in the wake of a quiet, peaceful passing. These were clues that demanded closer scrutiny. Investigators began cataloging what they found. Among Lynn's belongings were antidepressants, painkillers, and anti-anxiety medications. But what stood out was not just the amount, but the variety. Some bottles were nearly empty, others unopened. And some appeared to have been prescribed months earlier to other individuals. Then came the documents, financial papers, account statements, letters that seemed incomplete or oddly worded. Were they part of Lynn's everyday life? Or signs of something darker, perhaps financial stress, or even someone else's manipulation? At first glance, it looked like a simple reminder Lynn had written to herself. But the phrasing was unusual. Investigators didn't publicly release every detail. What they did reveal suggested this note may have pointed to Lynn's state of mind in the days leading up to her death, or perhaps it was left there for someone else to find. When news broke of Lynn's passing, her family and friends were devastated. To them, Lynn had been the glue that held so many relationships together. The thought of her life ending so suddenly was heartbreaking, but not entirely shocking, given her ongoing health challenges. Family members initially believed this was a tragic accident. Maybe her health finally caught up to her. Maybe she had mismanaged her medications. But as police findings slowly trickled out, cracks began to form in that narrative. Some family members expressed doubt. They wondered if Lynn could have really overdosed on her own. Others questioned whether she would have ever written that strange note. And soon, Whispers began. Was this really an accident? Or was there something far more sinister at play? Police were careful in their wording. Their first official statements to the press described Lynn's death as not immediately suspicious, but they stopped short of calling it natural. Instead, they announced that the case remained under investigation. This vague phrasing left room for speculation, and speculation spread quickly. Local news outlets picked up the story, reporting the unusual circumstances. Neighbors began asking questions. And the more the community learned about the details, the medications, the note, the financial records, the harder it was to believe that Lynn's death was a simple, tragic accident. And with each passing day, the once clear picture of Lynn's life began to blur. Who had access to her medications? Who might benefit from her financial troubles or her death? And most importantly, what had really happened inside that quiet home on that October morning? What started as a routine welfare check had now become a growing mystery. Police wouldn't call it murder. They wouldn't call it suicide. Wouldn't even call it an accident. Instead, Lynn Hernan's death remained suspended in a shadowy, in-between space, a case teetering on the edge of explanation, but never quite falling into place. For her family, this was torment. For investigators, it was the beginning of a much deeper dive. Because if Lynn's death wasn't natural, then someone, somewhere, knew the truth. And the question that haunted everyone in Waukesha was, who? As detectives dug deeper, they would uncover a series of startling details, pieces of Lynn's life that no one had ever expected to surface. From her finances to her relationships, everything was suddenly under the microscope. And each discovery only made the case more disturbing. This was no longer about a woman who had simply died alone. This was about uncovering whether Lynn Hernan's death was the result of tragic chance or something carefully orchestrated. By the time Lynn Hernan's body was transported to the Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's office, investigators still weren't convinced this was anything more than a natural passing. After all, Lynn had been battling health issues for years. She was 58 years old, lived alone, and had prescriptions for multiple conditions. But as the autopsy began, what seemed straightforward suddenly became far more complicated. October 28, 2018. The autopsy of Lynn Hernan officially begins. Forensic pathologist Dr. Brian Peterson, well respected in Milwaukee County, leads the procedure. His initial expectation is to confirm a death consistent with heart failure or complications from her long-standing medical issues. But within minutes, things weren't lining up. Externally, Lynn showed no signs of trauma, no bruises, no lacerations, no injuries suggesting foul play. But what stood out almost immediately was the presence of several prescription pill bottles near her body, far more than a typical patient might keep on hand. Investigators collected them as evidence, labeling and sealing them for toxicology. As the autopsy moved forward, Lynn's internal organs showed relatively mild disease, some liver congestion, some early kidney issues, but nothing immediately fatal. Her heart was enlarged, yes, but not to the degree that would typically cause sudden death. In short, there was no clear-cut natural explanation, no external trauma, no advanced organ failure. Cause of death, not immediately apparent. And when the toxicology samples were sent off for analysis, that's when the case began to shift entirely. What they revealed stunned the pathologists. Lethal levels of fentanyl detected. Presence of other controlled medications including benzodiazepines. Combined drug effect ruled out accidental low-dose ingestion. Lynn had not just trace amounts of fentanyl in her system. She had a lethal concentration, a dose so high that even experienced users would likely not survive. And paired with sedatives, the combination was catastrophic. Investigators quickly realized this was no natural death. But the bigger question, how did fentanyl, one of the deadliest opioids on the street, end up inside her body? According to Lynn's prescription history, she had not been prescribed fentanyl patches or fentanyl tablets. Her medical records did not reflect any legitimate prescription for this drug, which means someone had access to a controlled substance and introduced it into her system. Investigators began retracing Lynn's final days. Had she obtained it herself? Was it given to her under the guise of another medication? Or did someone deliberately administer it without her knowledge? But then came another twist, suspicious irregularities in pharmacy records. Several prescriptions filled under Lynn's insurance account. Medications inconsistent with her known medical conditions. Some prescriptions appeared forged or altered. Had someone been abusing Lynn's medical insurance? Or worse, had someone been using her name to obtain drugs for themselves? As each detail unfolded, the narrative surrounding Lynn's death shifted. What first looked like a woman tragically passing away alone began to resemble something far more sinister, a potential exploitation of her vulnerabilities. Her medical history and her access to prescriptions and the fentanyl. It was the smoking gun. But no one could yet answer the most chilling question. Was Lynn's death an overdose or a carefully staged murder? Toxicology didn't just reveal drugs in Lynn's system, it revealed deception in her life. Someone had been tampering with her prescriptions. Someone had access to her home, her medications, and ultimately her fate. But who and why? As investigators dug deeper, the trail of evidence pointed to financial motives, hidden relationships, and a shocking betrayal that no one could have anticipated. And what they uncovered next would forever change how Lynn's story was remembered. Families often appear perfect from the outside, but behind closed doors, the bonds that should protect us can sometimes be the very ties that destroy us. In the early stages of the investigation, family members gave statements that seemed supportive, even grieving. But as detectives dug deeper, one individual's name kept surfacing: Lynn's son. He had been one of the closest people to her, yet something about his behavior raised immediate red flags. Investigators noted inconsistencies in his initial interviews. He described his mother's health as failing rapidly, yet Lynn's medical records showed no major terminal conditions. He claimed Lynn was financially stable, yet police discovered unpaid bills, hidden debts, and unusual withdrawals. Those closest to Lynn described a woman who was kind, generous, and trusting. But over time, it seemed her independence was shrinking. Friends recalled how Lynn once handled her own affairs, yet in her later years, her son began to take over everything. He controlled her medications, often insisting on managing what she took. He oversaw her financial accounts, allegedly to help her. He even began isolating her from certain friends, claiming they were taking advantage of her. It painted a picture of subtle but increasing control. To outsiders, it might have looked like caregiving. But to investigators, it began to resemble coercion. Money became the next critical thread. Detectives subpoenaed bank records, and what they uncovered shocked even seasoned investigators. There were repeated large withdrawals from Lynn's account's amounts she was unlikely to have authorized on her own. Transactions included $5,000 cash withdrawals, wire transfers to her son's accounts, and sudden life insurance policy changes. A new policy worth six figures had been taken out less than a year before her death, with her son listed as the primary beneficiary. Friends claimed Lynn had mentioned wanting her granddaughter to be the beneficiary, but those changes never materialized. If Lynn's death was accidental, her son would inherit everything. If it was intentional, the motive had been sitting in plain sight all along. But money wasn't the only thing raising suspicion. Detectives revisited his testimony, comparing it against medical evidence, phone records, and financial timelines. He claimed he hadn't been near Lynn's home in the 24 hours before she was found. But phone tower pings showed his cell was in her neighborhood. He said Lynn was in good spirits, yet a handwritten note found in her bedroom suggested otherwise. The note mentioned feeling controlled and not having choices anymore. He described her medications as prescribed by her doctor, yet the prescriptions didn't match any legitimate pharmacy records. Every statement seemed to unravel the deeper they looked. It was no longer just about whether Lynn had died naturally. It was about whether her son had engineered the circumstances that led to her death. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. The son's financial gain, the contradictions in his testimony, the control he exerted, and the suspicious medications all pointed in one direction. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. Detectives needed concrete proof. The question investigators now faced was chilling. Was this the tragic end of a woman in poor health, or had her own son orchestrated her death for money? The answer lay buried in the evidence, and the truth was about to come to light. As the investigation deepened, it became clear this was no accident. It was a family web of secrets, and at the center stood Lynn's son. When Lynn's sudden death first came to light, it was treated as a personal tragedy, shocking, but not necessarily suspicious. Yet as detectives combed through every detail of her final days, the pieces of the puzzle began to rearrange themselves. What had once looked like an accident was now beginning to resemble something far darker, a carefully orchestrated plan. The police timeline began with the most basic task: reconstructing Lynn's last 48 hours. What had she eaten? Who had she spoken to? Where had she gone? These were simple questions, but the answers turned out to be anything but simple. As whispers of foul play leaked, the case caught the attention of local media. Journalists swarmed court buildings, demanding answers. For the first time, the private grief of Lynn's family was pushed into the public spotlight. With each nightly news report, the pressure mounted not only on investigators, but also on Lynn's son, who now found himself portrayed as a figure of intrigue and suspicion. The turning point came when prosecutors received the preliminary findings from investigators. What they saw was enough to justify opening a formal criminal inquiry. Quietly, a case file thickened with bank statements, insurance documents, text message logs, and toxicology analysis. Legal experts began preparing for a potential case of fraud and homicide. Behind closed doors, strategy meetings were held. Every piece of evidence was scrutinized for how it could play before a jury. To prosecutors, the story was taking shape. Lynn's son had motive, means, and opportunity. The alleged motive, financial gain, tied to insurance and inheritance. The means, prescription medications and substances found in Lynn's system. And the opportunity, her declining health, a vulnerability he could exploit. But prosecutors knew suspicion wasn't enough. They needed a clear, airtight story that would hold up in court. Finally, after months of collecting evidence, detectives made their move. Early one morning, they arrived with an arrest warrant. The charge: suspicion of fraud and ultimately homicide. Neighbors recalled the shock of watching officers lead him away. Soon after the arrest, prosecutors announced the charges publicly. They alleged that Lynn's son had manipulated her finances, falsified documents, and may have intentionally contributed to her death. What had once been considered a tragic accident was now officially categorized as a crime. The list of charges included fraudulent use of financial documents, forgery related to medical or insurance papers, criminal neglect and exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and, most importantly, homicide. The case had all the hallmarks of a media storm: family betrayal, hidden motives, and a death that now seemed anything but natural. Public opinion quickly split into two camps: those who believed Lynn's son was guilty of orchestrating a cold-blooded crime, and those who insisted he was being framed by circumstance. Talk shows debated the evidence, newspapers ran editorials, and social media swirled with speculation. Prosecutors knew they had a delicate balance to strike. On one hand, they had compelling circumstantial evidence: the financial motive, the toxicology, the inconsistencies in testimony. On the other, they lacked a definitive, single piece of proof that tied everything neatly together. Their strategy became clear: stack the small inconsistencies until they formed an undeniable picture of guilt. As the case unfolded, what once looked like an accident began to take the shape of a carefully planned deception. The deeper detectives dug, the more chilling the picture became. The evidence suggested a web of lies and control: a mother who may have unknowingly lived her final months under manipulation, a son who prosecutors claimed had been quietly pulling the strings. But the arrest was only the beginning. Ahead lay the courtroom, the stage where prosecutors would present their carefully built case, and where the defense would do everything possible to tear it apart. The battle for truth was far from over. The courthouse became the final stage where truth and lies would collide. For months, the community had speculated, whispered, and debated. But now, inside these walls, it was time for answers. The trial of Lynn's son would not only expose his actions, but also reveal the dark web of deceit that had been woven long before her death. Trials in high-profile cases are rarely just about evidence. They're about emotion, perception, and persuasion. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken. On one side, grieving family members desperate for justice. On the other, supporters of the accused, clinging to hope that there was another explanation. Reporters filled the back rows, pens and cameras ready to capture every word. From the moment the trial began, the case drew national media attention. Headlines painted the accused as a manipulator, a son who put greed above blood. But in the courtroom, only one narrative would matter: the one that 12 jurors believed. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. Their argument was clear: Lynn's son had both motive and opportunity. At the heart of it, money. Life insurance policies worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, bank withdrawals that coincided with her declining health, and messages that suggested control over her decisions. The prosecution introduced testimony after testimony. A financial advisor explained unusual account changes. A friend of Lynn described how she confided about feeling pressured, even manipulated, by her son. And perhaps most damning, investigators who revealed a paper trail leading directly back to the accused. In private messages, he spoke of financial stress, of debts piling up, of desperation. The prosecution argued that desperation turned into motive, and motive turned into murder. One of the most emotional moments came when Lynn's closest friend took the stand. Fighting back tears, she told the court how Lynn once confided, "I feel like I'm not in control of my own life anymore." Those words echoed through the courtroom, leaving an unforgettable silence. Another key testimony came from a medical professional, who testified that Lynn's health was deteriorating. But the circumstances surrounding her care raised questions. Records showed missed appointments, unexplained medication changes, and sudden lapses in monitoring. But the defense was prepared. Their argument? That this was a grieving family, being misled by circumstantial evidence? They painted a different picture. A son, overwhelmed by responsibility, misunderstood in his attempts to help. The defense brought forward character witnesses, friends, neighbors, even co-workers who described the accused as devoted, attentive, and incapable of such cruelty. They argued the financial evidence was misleading, that debts and withdrawals were normal parts of managing a struggling household. And when it came to Lynn's words, the defense insisted they had been taken out of context. Stress, illness, and confusion, they argued, could easily be misinterpreted. In a bold move, the defense had the accused take the stand. His testimony would become one of the most pivotal moments of the trial, he said. "I loved my mother. Everything I did, every decision was to help her. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I struggled financially, but I would never harm her. She was my mother." His words carried weight, but the prosecution wasted no time dismantling them on cross-examination. Prosecutor argumented that if you loved your mother so much, why did you cash her checks behind her back? Did you change her insurance policies to name yourself as the sole beneficiary? And why, sir, did Lynn tell her closest friends that she felt controlled by you? The accused's credibility began to crumble. Each answer seemed weaker than the last, and the jurors took note. And then came the bombshell, a witness no one expected. A former associate of the accused, who revealed details about conversations where he allegedly boasted about money he would soon inherit. The timing, just weeks before Lynn's death. The revelation stunned everyone, including the jury. It was no longer just about finances or control. It now appeared to be about premeditation. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and emotion, it all came down to closing arguments. According to the prosecutor, closing argument: do not be fooled by excuses. Do not be blinded by tears. Look at the evidence. Look at the patterns. This was not love, it was greed. This was not courage, it was control. And Lynn paid the ultimate price. Defense attorney gave his closing argument saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has told you a story. But stories are not proof. Do not convict on speculation. Do not convict on grief. My client loved his mother. That love may not have been perfect, but it was real. It was not criminal." The jury deliberated for hours, weighing every word, every piece of evidence. When they returned, the room fell silent. Court clerk announced the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The verdict sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Guilty on all counts. The accused showed little reaction, but the weight of the decision was clear. Judge announced the sentence. "For the crime of first-degree murder, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. The son who once stood as caretaker was now revealed as perpetrator. And Lynn's story, tragic, haunting, had reached its painful conclusion. Trials do more than deliver verdicts. They unearth the truth. In the end, Lynn's life was not defined by the betrayal she suffered, but by the love she gave. While her son's choices led him to a prison cell, her memory lives on as a reminder of how even the closest bonds can be twisted by greed. And in that courtroom, every secret, every deception was laid bare until nothing remained but the truth. Even after the verdict was read, Even after the sentence was handed down, the shadow of this case lingered. For the community, for Lynn's family, and for everyone who followed the story, it didn't end with the gavel's strike. The local community was shaken to its core. Lynn Hernan wasn't just another name in the news. She was their neighbor, their friend, someone they knew from church gatherings, grocery store encounters, or charity events. Her sudden, tragic death, followed by the disturbing revelations about manipulation and betrayal, was almost too much for people to comprehend. Across town, vigils were held in Lynn's honor. Dozens gathered holding candles, remembering not just the tragedy of her passing, but the warmth and generosity she brought into people's lives. For many, these gatherings became a way to cope with a loss that felt both intimate and unsettling. To those who knew her best, Lynn is remembered not for the case that would later define her in the media, but for the life she lived. She was known as a woman of resilience, compassion, and humor. She loved animals, treasured time with family, and always sought to see the good in others. In the face of tragedy, loved ones have worked tirelessly to ensure that Lynn's legacy is not overshadowed. Some have even created community scholarships in her name, turning pain into purpose and making sure her spirit continues to touch lives. Yet even with a conviction, the story of Lynn Hernan's death remains tangled in mystery. Was it truly the result of years of calculated manipulation? Was she coerced in ways we still don't fully understand? Or was there a deeper layer of deception that never surfaced in court? Some investigators believe not every piece of evidence was brought forward. Others argue that unanswered questions remain about the timeline of events, the financial entanglements, and the psychological control that may have played a role. Did Lynn ever suspect the truth? Did she cry for help that no one recognized at the time? These are questions that still haunt those closest to the case. Beyond the individuals directly affected, Lynn's case sparked broader conversations about emotional manipulation, financial abuse, and the hidden dangers that can exist within relationships. It highlighted how exploitation often doesn't come with warning signs loud enough for outsiders to hear, and how trust, when placed in the wrong hands, can be devastatingly fragile. Lynn Hernan's story is not just about crime, it's about betrayal, trust, and the devastating consequences of secrets kept in silence. Her death leaves behind a legacy of love, but also of unanswered questions. Questions that may never have answers. One thing is certain. This case stands as a haunting reminder of how easily trust can be exploited, and how fragile the line between love and betrayal truly is. This was the Crime Decoder. Thank you for joining us as we unraveled the story of Lynn Hernan. If you found this case as unsettling as we did, make sure to subscribe for more deep dive investigations into the cases the headlines never fully explain.